Hello, friends. We are in a troubling time when it comes to misinformation. The views of our guests do not reflect that of my own. This show is for entertainment purposes only, and any information presented during this show is a live-action role-play scenario. All that being said, enjoy this episode. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Weezy, host of What is Truth podcast. First, a couple of announcements. Be sure to watch the Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana, available on Tubi and multiple streaming platforms. Also, be sure to download all our podcast episodes directly through Spreaker if you listen through any audio podcast provider. We are booking guests for February. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com, and be sure to visit our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. It's also the home of the Forbidden Knowledge Network. We feature some of your favorite podcasts and content creators. Today, I want to welcome back to the show Weezy. He is host of the What is Truth podcast. His show covers many topics and subjects. Among his favorites are the Lincoln Assassination, moon landings, 9/11, obscure history, and much more. Weezy, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing rather exquisite, my friend. Always a treat to be on the Forbidden Knowledge News Network.
Yes, man. It's always a treat to have you. Welcome back. Very much looking forward to this today. You're going to be sharing your research into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, in just a few short years, there has been a growing understanding that our documented history is riddled with bullshit. From the Civil War to World War II, JFK assassination, Vietnam, 9/11, COVID, the list goes on and on. It's all a massive theatrical production to keep the masses in a box and remain compliant cattle. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your research into this. I haven't really gotten into any Abraham Lincoln research, so this is going to be something new for me. I'm going to be learning something myself today. Before we get into it, though, remind the audience, it's been a little while since you've been on, remind the audience about yourself and where they can find you.
Well, I've been doing podcasts now for a few years. It's crazy how time flies. And I first started doing shows just drinking beers on the beach, talking shit. And before I knew it, I had an audience. Still a small show, but it's growing, and I am forever grateful for that and thankful, and especially for friends like you that have helped my little tiny show grow. But yeah, I mean, I've been down this rabbit hole for a few years now, and probably one of my influential heroes, if you will, has been the late great David McGowan.
Yeah.
When I found him a few years back, I was infatuated with his work, with the way he analyzed things through a critical lens and broke things down and asked questions that once you heard him raise up these questions, like, God damn, how come I didn't think of that? And then they become so obvious, but he was a master at first pointing these things out. So what got me down the Lincoln assassination was a book that he wrote, Why Everything You Think You Know About the Lincoln Assassination Is Wrong. And I started reading it, and I was like, man, this is freaking fascinating shit, because I didn't know much about the issue at all. And I ended up voicing over that audiobook. And you can tell I just dove in. You can still get it's a great gist of it. So you can find it on my podcast platforms by searching What is Truth Podcast by Weezy. But as I started reading it, and you can tell that I just dove in because I got some of the names wrong. So if you're listening to it, like he's getting the names wrong, yeah, because I just dove in, and that's what got everything going for me. You know, I had heard the story about some guy named John Wilkes Booth, an actor that hated Lincoln, shot him, and that's the end of the story. You know, in a nutshell. But then once you start finding out that there was so much to the story and so many actors that over 160 years, you forget these names. People don't talk about it anymore. I felt like I wanted to bring something new to the table, and bring a different perspective, and carrying that mantle that the late great David McGowan inspired. So a lot of my research is inspired through him. I have been able to come up with some of my own unique takes on it, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention David McGowan as a huge inspiration to this.
Yeah, we gave him some props the other day. I had Ola Demigard on, and we were talking about the Laurel Canyon scene and gave major props to David McGowan on his research into that. But you mentioned John Wilkes Booth was an actor. And now in our modern society, with what we know now, especially if you have eyes to see, and if you're in the conspiracy, quote unquote, community, you'll understand that these actors show up everywhere, and now you can find your John Wilkes Booth through Central Casting. This is your first clue to a theatrical production, if you will, something that was planned for a very long time and set up. But I really want to get into your research. Where does this all start?
Well, I think we should kind of, brush over the official tale, in as quick as a nutshell as I can, and then break it down from there. Like I stated, I think a lot of people have that same view that I quickly stated, where it's just an actor that hated Lincoln. I think a lot of people have heard that he apparently, after shooting Lincoln, leaps out of the box at Ford's Theater. Most people will say he broke his leg, put the knife up in the air, dagger down, bloodless by all witness accounts, and says, "Sic semper tyrannis, the South is avenged." And then, even though he had a broken leg, hauls ass out of the theater, and he escapes. He's on the lam for a couple of weeks. In the meantime, and I have a paper clipping from 1865, a couple of days after, actually 1 day from April 16th. So this happened on April 14th. Is when he got shot. Lincoln survives for a few hours, basically brain dead, just breathing essentially, and passes away at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. But so and the reason I bring up these newspapers, they said that immediately afterwards they knew who the suspects was. Very similar to 9/11, when the towers are still burning and we're seeing Osama bin Laden's head getting put on the TV. This is why I got fascinated with this Lincoln stuff, because even though it's 160 years ago, you can see so many things in today's questionable events, and you're like, holy crap. And if you don't know any of this stuff, then you'll see it on, you'll see stuff in the news and it just goes above your head because you have no idea of this past historical precedents, if you will. And so going back to the story, Lincoln escapes. In this meantime, they round up the co-conspirators, which, when you look at these characters, they were just a ragtag band of of folks who I come to view as patsies. You needed someone to blame, and put put justice to this. Justice has been served, just like we needed to go to Iraq or any of the, you need to have a purpose for all this, and give something that the public will accept. You know, that justice was pursued and taken. So I view a lot of these guys as simple patsies, and 4 of them eventually were hung, including Mary Surratt, which was the first female inmate to be, executed by the U.S. government. And the interesting thing is, one of the co-conspirators was Mr. John Surratt Jr., her son, who wasn't even in the area at the time. He escapes over to New York and then leaves the country, goes to Europe, goes to Egypt. But and I just want to brush up on him because his story seems to get forgotten. John Surratt Jr. later goes to trial. So while his mom got hung, John Surratt Jr. was viewed as the second main co-conspirator behind John Wilkes Booth. And yet, when he eventually faces trial a couple of years later, he gets acquitted 8-4. So the second
So they had co-conspirators, and this is something that we never hear about, right?
Yeah. And yeah, so you're right. And stop me, like, if I'm not making sense, and I'll elaborate. It's all in my head right now. And I completely realize I may be throwing out so much information and getting ahead of myself. So yeah, please do stop me. Yeah, so there were indeed co-conspirators involved, because a lot of people think that the conspiracy only involved the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But in reality, the conspiracy, quote unquote, involved not only killing Lincoln, but Secretary of State William Seward, and you'll also hear Vice President Johnson was also due to get assassinated, and Ulysses S. Grant was also due to get assassinated, and even Edwin McStanton. And these are things you will rarely hear, but the mainstream people will mention this up. Now, I'm going to bring up some suspects that no mainstream people will ever even touch on, or maybe even think I'm out of line by suggesting them as suspects, but I will provide my evidence as to why I feel that way. And so, just going back, it was a conspiracy that involved several people. The other big part and component to this is the attack on the Seward Mansion, which we are told was carried out by a 20-year-old named Lewis Thornton Powell, whom, if you just Google him and find his pictures, he looks like a freaking movie star. He looks like he would be doing Calvin Klein commercials. And if you look at the pictures, try to find a scratch or a bruise or anything on him. You won't find any. And this is important because we are told he was given the task of assassinating Secretary of State William Seward. And in that house were 5 able-bodied men, up to 3 women. So, nearly 10 people in that house. Mr. Powell, we are told, goes into the house, beats the living shit out of everyone, knocking people out, breaking guns on people's heads. How that is even possible without killing that person is beyond me, but this is the mainstream story. And he does all this, gets to his target, Secretary of State Seward, who was already bedridden, and conveniently, just a couple of weeks prior to this alleged attack, he had been involved in a horse carriage accident in which his neck was covered with a neck brace. And the mainstream will tell you that's what saved the Secretary of State's life. As Lewis Powell, a Southern boy, was slashing away, he was just hitting the thing. And I want to get into all these silly aspects to these alleged incidents. And so that was an attack. Now, the attack on Vice President Johnson was staying at the Kirkwood Hotel, not far, from Ford's Theater. And one of the co-conspirators, George Atzerodt, a little chubby German immigrant drunk dude, he was tasked with the job of killing him, allegedly. And the official tale tells us that he chickened out, got drunk, and decided not to go along, to kill Vice President Johnson. And he's hung anyways, even though he pussed out, confessed, they hung him as well. So in a very, very brief nutshell, that is the Lincoln assassination. Now, the coincidences, all the parts that don't make sense. I saw you smirking at some of the details to the official story. This is exactly why I've been fascinated, because it is an event that has been passed off as historical fact, just like the moon landings or name whatever event. Yeah. And people will never go any deeper and question it any further, partially because they know very little about the event to begin with. And then secondly, because how this is history. Yeah. Historical. How dare you question it?
Well, let's get into that. Let's dissect the official narrative versus what was really happening. I don't know how much you've looked into Ryan Dawson's work about who Lincoln really was and how much of a facade his life was. That's one thing. And then we have the official narrative of why he was supposedly assassinated, slavery, a vengeance for the South. And then there's, of course, the real story. Let's talk a little bit about those things and see if we can maybe find the root of what was really behind everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I did a show with Ryan Dawson on Lincoln as well a couple years back. And in today's revisionist history, I would call it, we are viewed as Abraham Lincoln as almost a Christ-like figure, which kind of makes sense because he was killed or he was shot at on a Good Friday, and what people don't realize is that even in Lincoln's time, he wasn't liked, obviously, by his opposition, but even within his own party, he wasn't liked. He was viewed as a tyrant. People forget that under Lincoln, habeas corpus was suspended. And so a lot of people today will say, our constitutional rights are being violated in 2025, blah, blah, blah. And like, wait a minute, you're right. But this shit is nothing new. You go back to Lincoln's day and people were getting arrested for bullshit reasons, and essentially kidnapped and extorted. The Constitution didn't mean jack shit in 1865. So it's nothing new under the sun. And that's another reason why I'm attracted to this whole Lincoln assassination. Another thing that rarely gets mentioned about Lincoln is the Dakota 38, in which 30 Dakota Indians were hung for being accused of some petty crimes. And actually, the 38 that were hung were whittled down from 300. And so that is the largest mass execution by the government in history. 38 all in a row hung, man. And that rarely gets talked about. Lincoln signed
I love, like
off.
You said, he was portrayed as this Christ-like figure, but in reality, he was probably the most racist motherfucker you could have ever imagined.
Yeah. His views on black people really get glossed over, man, because even black folks will say Lincoln ended slavery and they hold him in a pedestal, but that's all bullshit propaganda. Now, before moving on, he also rarely gets brought up with the Andersonville debacle. There's a great movie that came out on the Andersonville prison. You can actually find it on YouTube for free. Someone's uploaded there. Great movie. And it's a messed up situation in where the South was a ragtag army. Really what gave them a fighting chance was General Lee and he was a mastermind as a general, as a military tactician, but they didn't have the money nor the manpower that the North did. And that was their final downfall. So the prisoners held at Andersonville prison, they had tens of thousands in there, and they lived in abhorrent, terrible situations, man. Just it's one of those situations where you literally couldn't even picture it, man. Literally living hell on earth. There was a little stream that ran through the prison, and they were to use that stream for drinking water and to bathe. And so thousands died each week because of the diseases that ran rampant. And people were begging for the U.S., the North, to send money to these people, help them out, because the South could only give them so much. And they couldn't even feed, the South couldn't even feed its own prisoners. So when food did come about, who do you think they're going to feed first? Or not, I'm sorry, their own prisoners, their own security officers, their military staff that was staffing it. So when food did come every now and then, who do you think was being fed first? Their own people, and so the prisoners, it was a horrible and atrocious situation that Lincoln ever rarely gets connected to, and the North's view on its prisoners was that they've got more manpower, and if we engage with prison swaps with the South, it helps out the South more than it helps out the North, So in other words, the Northern folks were more expendable. We got more people to plug them in. But if we send whatever we capture to the South, they're just going to go back to fighting us again. So it's not. That's the way they justified it, and that's the way they viewed it. A real messed up way, if you ask me. But I don't want to completely shit on on Lincoln. He did do a couple good things. One of those that stick out as a Mexican American was how he was vehemently anti-U.S. Mexican war. He was saying that's a bullshit war. Why are we meddling in territory that isn't U.S. land? And so that's another thing that also doesn't really get mentioned, how hardcore anti-war he was in that aspect. But touching back on why, the official story will sometimes hint that it was a Southern plot to kill Lincoln, to avenge the South, quote unquote. But there isn't very strong evidence to support that. Now, there is stronger evidence that part of the reason they got him killed, and I believe it was a plot from both sides, North and South. Just like today, how you can't say it's just one party, man. Both sides are shit and corrupt. So I view it in that same context even back then. But Lincoln wanted to, as the war was winding down, he wanted to have a peaceful transition, and people under Lincoln, like the Edwin Stantons and whatnot, they wanted hardcore sanctions. Like, you guys try to raise up against us, let's milk this bitch for as much as we can, and punish the South, for their rebellion, against the Union. And so Lincoln was against that, and to me that makes a lot more sense. Let's take out the guy that's isn't really gonna capitalize on this whole thing. Let's get him out of the way, and we'll pass our own agendas. And that's pretty much what happened once Vice President Johnson took the reins. So as far as evidence, there is certainly evidence to back up that more likely scenario.
Yeah. One of the biggest things that I had to realize before I could make any headway with any type of conspiracy research, anything having to do with our hidden history, is that there are no good guys. When it comes to that level of power, no one at that level has humanity's best interests in mind. It's all about power, corruption, and control. It seems like these things are planned for an extremely long time before they occur. That's the only answer that can make sense when looking back at all of this stuff. There's too much evidence that we can look at now that there is this link between all of these events going back to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and before. This has always been like this, and most of us are just, at least in this community, are just starting to see it. So that was the biggest thing, and I think that's the easiest way that we can really navigate this stuff is to realize, first off, there are no good guys, and none of this was ever done for the benefit of humanity. It's always been done for the benefit of those parasites so that they can have more power and control.
Yeah, 100%. I'm going to be doing a show in a couple of weeks with one of my listeners turned almost co-researcher, co-podcaster. And we're going to be doing a show on the Newberg conspiracy, which is the first documented American conspiracy. And I brought it up to big level names in the podcasting community, historians. And every time I brought it up, they most of them have never even heard of it.
Yeah, so I actually haven't. Tell me about this. What is this?
So I'll give you I'm going to do a deep dive in a couple of weeks with my listener. Shout out to Ergo. But it happens just shortly after the Revolutionary War. And money was running out for the newly free, colonies, if you will, the new American empire. And a lot of the veterans from the Revolutionary War were getting kind of frustrated, kind of pissed off that they weren't getting money. They were going hungry. Like, we just fought for this new country and there ain't no money. What the hell's going on? And so there was mutiny going on. And the official tale tells us that George Washington met with these guys. And I'll just give you the quick. So if you guys want to get deep, definitely follow the show because I'm going to go deeper. But we are told in this one that George Washington, being an older guy, he's kind of crying. He's sad that his soldiers are about to revolt, and he gives this patriotic speech and keeps the men together and be like, look, guys, this is what we fought for. This was the whole point of it. Just stick it out a little longer and we're going to get our shit together. And so we are viewed as George Washington, being the hero even then, like there was a crisis at the very beginning at the start of this nation. And George Washington smashes it down like the true boss that we have been told he was. Now, in my opinion, and we're going to go deeper, as I've already mentioned and teased, my theory is that whole story is more propaganda, more bullshit. That's exactly when the banks took over. And that's exactly when our system, which, I mean, that was really what the Revolutionary War, taxation is theft. Let's get away from the Bank of England nonsense. And we're fed this little story, the Newberg conspiracy story. And I think it's just a cover. That's exactly what happened. So that's just a teaser. But I agree with you, man. It's these things have happened, from the dawn of time. I mean, the tying it back to the Lincoln assassination, Julius Caesar was killed by Brutus and all these senators in a conspiracy. John Wilkes Booth's dad was Brutus Junius Booth, and his son kills Lincoln like a Caesar period. It's so comical, man, these little things. So unexpectedly I was able to tie it back in, to the whole Lincoln assassination. But yeah, man, any other questions before we start really digging into the good stuff?
No, I just have an observation. It seems like all of these major players throughout our history that had a massive effect on the direction that we were headed globally. JFK, Lincoln, all these people that ended up being assassinated, seems like they were used, they had a purpose to fulfill, and after it was done, they were taken out. And I'm not even sure if these players realize what they're a part of. Maybe they, in their mind, they believe that they're really doing something good, that they are making change, and they aren't even aware of the greater plot of what's happening, that they're going to be taken out later. But it does kind of seem that way with all these major players that have been assassinated throughout history. They serve a purpose, and then they're taken out either to add that extra impact to the events or close it out so that they can't cause any damage or undo what they did before. There's tons of possibilities with this, but the main thing is it's all theater, and these people are being used to serve a purpose.
Yeah, I firmly believe that the world is indeed a stage, and we are just witnessing this whole sideshow. Unfortunately, it's only a few of us that are in tune with these shenanigans, and we can see it from afar, call it out for what it really is. But unfortunately, the masses go along with it each and every time. That's one of the reasons why they rarely change up the skit or the script. You know, I'm going to point out a few things, like I mentioned at the very beginning, that unless you know these things, you know you'll see them and it'll go over your head. So that might be one of the reasons why you don't catch it, or you're just a normie. You accept everything that comes out, you know, on the mainstream presses, and don't ever bother to question it. And I think the vast majority of people don't question it.
Right. It's a threat to
So yeah,
their status quo. It's a threat to their everyday normal life, to their job, to everything they're used to. So it's probably easier to bury your head in the sand than become aware of some of this stuff, because it can be terrifying when you first wake up. I know that.
yeah, 100%, man. And which begs the question: what is the reality? What is truth at the end of the day? Like, it's amazing. It continues to amaze me how two people can look at exactly the same damn thing, the same data, the same event, and yet come to two completely polar opposite takes on a situation. And that's always fascinating to me. And I'm curious how that always happens. You know, it's one of those quests, you know, and I sometimes wonder, not sometimes, I'm always wondering how much of the things that I have strong convictions for are actually indeed true. And I'm always, you know, and I just try to keep my mind open to new information coming in and being able to change my views on certain things, you know, as I come by it. Yeah, and that's what I've been doing even with this Lincoln assassination. I view David McGowan's work as the top of the work, but there's been a couple of things that he has pointed out, and I've researched, and I'm not going to say a couple things, one or two things. The majority of the stuff that he wrote could be documented and could be verified, but there was, you know, a couple of instances that I could definitely go over, in which I was like, oh man, that's not all right. But just because you find these things, does that mean you discard all the rest of their body of work? And vice versa for the same thing. You know, there could be someone that spews bullshit 98% of the time. That doesn't mean 100% of the shit they're saying is also wrong. So that's what makes it hard today, man. You're constantly sifting through the lies, through what can actually be verified and whatnot. And it makes things fun and frustrating at the same time.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely interesting. Definitely never a lack of new information to sift through, but I think we're doing the best we can with what we have, man, and that's all we can do. So let's get deeper into this, man. Where should we go next?
Well, I think we should start with the John Wilkes Booth assassinating Lincoln bit, which is, even if you don't know nothing about the rest of the Lincoln plot, you know, the Seward attack or the rest of the ragtag band of conspirators, most everyone will have at least heard, you know, that the assassination took place at Ford's Theater, and the play was coming down, winding down is what we are told. And there's a moment in the play where a funny line is delivered, and so the crowd erupts into laughter. And that's when Wilkes Booth, a former actor who knew the lines, who knew the play, that's when he decided to pull the trigger, which official story people will say that's what made people not hear the shots. Everyone's laughing, cracking up. So a lot of people didn't hear the shot. And then a scuffle happens between Henry Rathbone and John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth, after shooting Lincoln with a one-shot Derringer gun, starts slashing away at Henry Rathbone, who was in that box with Lincoln.
And Henry Rathbone was...
cuts him up.
Who?
Major. So there were 4 occupants in that presidential box at Ford Theater. Okay, it was like a VIP suite. Like right. When you go to sports events, I'm gonna go there in a couple of months on the 160th anniversary coming up in April, because 1865, 2025, that's 160 years. And once I see this presidential box in person, I'm going to really make some strong inferences. But right now I'm just, it's hard to find the actual dimensions of the box. Maybe there's a reason why it's hard to find, because the whole story starts to fall apart. But Henry Rathbone was, so in the box was Major Henry Rathbone, his wife, stepsister wife, may I add, Clara Harris, Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife, and then closest to the door was Abraham Lincoln, closest to the left-hand wall. So if you can picture, Lincoln is right by the door, furthest from the stage. Next to him, Mary Todd Lincoln. Next to her, Clara Harris. And closest to the stage, and in a little couch on the back, was Major Henry Rathbone. And based on his 1865 deposition, he describes the booth as between 9 and 11 feet by about 10 feet. So basically a 10 by 10 room. However, if you look at any YouTube videos of the presidential box at Ford's Theater, 10 feet in length sounds plausible 100%, but the width does not look like it's 10. It doesn't look like a 10 by 10. I'd say maybe 10 by 6, maybe 10 by 4. It's a little bit narrower. This is important because of some of the observations that I'm going to point out that you won't hear from anyone else. I'm trying to paint that scene in your head, okay? So a couple of weird anomalies, we find out once you start digging into the whole story of this. Allegedly, John Wilkes Booth did not commit. So John Wilkes Booth and his band of conspirators had planned out to initially kidnap Abraham Lincoln. They were going to kidnap him and hold him ransom in exchange for the release of Southern prisoners. And so that's how he was able to round up a lot of people. And very similar to 9/11, secret, the intelligence department of the Lincoln, cabinet knew about these guys and just let them run amok. They didn't arrest them, just like they knew about Muhammad Atta during 9/11 and didn't arrest them. It's like they know about these guys and just let them do as they wish. Some will say, well, they're trying to collect more evidence, blah, blah, blah. But anyways, they planned this kidnapping plot. And it wasn't until Friday, because it wasn't even very well known that Lincoln was going to attend this play on April 14th, and the war had just ended only a short time prior. The whole town, in Washington, in the Baltimore area, Maryland area, it was celebrations, man. It was party time, and everyone was on cloud 9, and it was announced that Lincoln was going to end up going to that play later on that night. And so that's when we are told John Wilkes Booth decides, all right, I'm going to kill him. And this is that little detail right there is another issue why it was wrong to hang the rest of the co-conspirators, because how the hell could they be charged with premeditated murder when John Wilkes Booth didn't plan on killing them until that very day? Does that make sense? If anything, they should have been convicted of trying, to kidnap Lincoln, but they shouldn't have been hung. So that's one of the issues that doesn't get talked about by the mainstream folks. But the key part, another key component to this, to Friday, the events that happened to Friday and led up, to the shooting of Abraham Lincoln later on that night, is how Lincoln originally wanted Thomas Eckert to be present with him at the presidential box. It was supposed to be Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant said, "Sorry, man, I'm going to meet with my kids up in New York," and he had to take a train out of town. Kind of like Larry Silverstein, bro. Just having to have a haircut. Yeah. It's one of those situations. So in my view of it, I'm viewing Ulysses S. Grant as a suspect that at the very least knew shit was going down and he got the hell out. This is something you won't hear really anyone ever say, like, what? Ulysses S. Grant? How dare you? But how convenient that you're going to bail out. And he took a midnight train out of town when he could have easily taken the 6 a.m. train the next morning and been there at almost the same amount of time as the midnight train without having to red eye the damn ride. You know what I mean? You would have been able to sleep in your own bed. You got to party with Lincoln, held as a hero. And had Ulysses S. Grant been there, he would have had a gun and if the official story were true, he would have smoked Wilkes Booth. But Ulysses S. Grant says, "No, man, I can't make it, bro. Sorry." The official narrative people will say, well, his wife had beef with Mary Todd Lincoln and she was kind of crazy and she was hard to get along with. That's the official narrative explanation for it. I view it as complete and utter horseshit. So the next bodyguard that Lincoln wanted was Thomas Eckert, who was just as big as Lincoln, a big dude, like a 6'3", 6'4", dude. He was the assistant secretary of war right under Edwin McMaster Stanton, who was the official secretary of war, whom I would compare to like a Dick Cheney of that era. Edwin Stanton, evil scumbag. And so Thomas Eckert, Lincoln wanted Thomas Eckert. He's like, I want this guy. If Ulysses S. Grant isn't going to be here, I want Thomas Eckert. Thomas Eckert says, "Sorry, man. I'm kind of busy. I'm going to be busy that night." Now, Thomas Eckert, his main job was to oversee the telegraph lines and system. So, actually, Lincoln asks Stanton if he could have Thomas Eckert, as his bodyguard. And Stanton says, "No, you can't. He's busy." Lincoln that Friday visits with Thomas Eckert, like, "Dude, what's up? Can you be here, tonight? Be there with me?" And he goes, "Sorry, man. Stanton told me, I can't. I'm just busy." So there's two times right there where the guy that Lincoln wanted to guard him denied him. This is a key part to it, so keep that in the back of your mind. So then Henry Rathbone is elected, kind of like a third place type of dude. The interesting thing about Henry Rathbone, in that box is later on, after the Lincoln assassination, he will go on to murder his wife and cut himself up and allege that someone attacked them. He gets thrown in the loony bin. He gets convicted. And official narrative people will rarely bring that part about it. And then when they do bring about it, be like, oh, well, he just had PTSD because he saw the Lincoln assassination. There. I'm like, dude, this dude was a military head honcho for the Civil War. One of the bloodiest things. I'm sure he's seen way crazier shit than
sounds like some MK Ultra shit right there.
Yeah, well, this is key because I list Henry Rathbone as a very extreme suspect in this because when this event happens at Ford's Theater, the only people that were witnesses to this alleged event of Lincoln getting shot in the back of the head were those four people: Lincoln himself, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, Clara Harris, and Henry Rathbone. And yet the only words that were ever heard in trial were Henry Rathbone's 1865 deposition. He gave 2 depositions in 1865. And then later on, he gave a third deposition. He was called as a witness for the John Surratt Jr., where John Surratt Jr. was acquitted. So he gave his testimony 3 times. Now, this is where it gets freaking weird and why I, through the inspiration of David McGowan, view Henry Rathbone as extremely suspect. When people give depositions, when you are recalling events, it's probably normal that you are going to change your story up even a little bit here and there, as long as you have all the key elements roughly the same. There shouldn't be an issue. Maybe instead of talking about the lights being on, next time you talk about the carpet, little shit like that isn't going to affect the actual whole story, truth of the event. The problem with his depositions, his 3 depositions, is that he gave them word for word verbatim each and every time. The first deposition he gives,
interesting.
The first deposition he gives is in the third person. And so the only change he ever made from that very initial one to the second and third one is he changed it from the third person to the first person. That is one of the weirdest freaking things you can ever do. And no mainline historian has ever brought that up. Like, that's weird. Why is he repeating the same shit word for words, same damn manner, without any variations except from the third person to the first person? Super, super weird. Like, you don't freaking do that, man. It becomes apparent he learned the script
he rehearsed
and he was just reading it. Yeah. So we're told an actor, John Wilkes Booth, is the actor that was the one that did all this. But yeah, we have someone that's clearly rehearsing lines and doling out his memorized script, which is one of the weird, more fascinating things. Now, because Mary Todd Lincoln and because Claire Harris never gave any testimonies in trial, you have to look at his account of the event in its entirety, and it makes zero sense. Now, I found a few statements, by Mary Todd Lincoln, but she doesn't talk much about it. And then I found a statement from that 1865 newspaper clipping about Miss Clara Harris's account of the situation, and it makes zero sense. But if we go to Henry Rathbone's account of it, he's saying that they were just chilling in that box, and as far as he remembers, the door was open leading into that box. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. One last thing: there should have been an armed guard outside the door leading into that presidential box. There should have been. This is getting good, man. You're like, oh, okay. So I'm trying to weave all this together. So there was supposed to be an armed guard, and that was John F. Parker, who was specifically chosen by, of all people, Mary Todd Lincoln. There's letterhead on White House stationery, which oh shit, I don't have my book here with me. Uh, which the great Otto Eisenschimmel wrote in his 1937 book, and in which I have a copy of it, man. It's back from 1937, copyright, freaking awesome book. That's the book that inspired David McGowan as well. So great, awesome book for any Lincoln assassination enthusiast. And Otto Eisenschimmel shows in his book a copy of the White House stationery where Mary Todd Lincoln is asking for specifically John F. Parker to be, the bodyguard outside the presidential box. She also later writes a letter for him to be exempt from the draft. Why is John F. Parker? Why am I bringing him up? Because a lot of people will have zero freaking clue. Well, here's why it's important. Out of all the damn cops they could have chosen, the selection of John F. Parker is key because John F. Parker was one of the most demerited cops in the force. He was known to get drunk and bang out hookers. He was constantly written up for insolent and vulgar language. So this dude was, by all accounts, a certified 100% despicable scumbag. And so, and no one ever, like, for me to even say this is bananas, but it was inspired by McGowan. It's like, why the hell isn't Mary Todd Lincoln viewed as in a very suspect way? Because she chose him. So John F. Parker on that evening at Ford's Theater, instead of sitting on the chair, leading up to the presidential box, decided to get drunk and bang out some hookers. Huh. He disappeared for a couple of days. When he comes back and shows up to work, he shows up with a prostitute and tries to arrest her. Like, dude, weren't you supposed to be guarding Lincoln?
Wow.
He never gets reprimanded, never gets charged.
Huh.
And it's bananas, man. One of the very little parts that you don't hear on the official narrative. Now, mainline historians will talk about John F. Parker, like, but they never talk about, like, isn't it weird that Mary Todd Lincoln picked them of all people? Like, and they just view it as a giant coincidence that he just happened to get drunk that night. Like, it makes zero, that part of the story makes absolute zero sense. So now that we have that, we are told through Henry Rathbone's account that the door was open the entire night. And Henry Rathbone says that he first heard a gunshot and he then seized, after John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln, he yells, "Freedom!" It's almost like a cartoon, bro. Yells freedom. And then he lunges towards him, grapples with him, and Wilkes Booth slashes him allegedly. Then he gets on the banister and, the rest of the story. The problem with that is, as I've thought about this scene playing out in my head, is, all right, this is a small room, 10 by 6, 10 by 7 at the most. This door is open. You're going to tell me that John Wilkes Booth was able to open that door without arousing any suspicion. We are also told through the official narrative and through Henry Rathbone's testimony later that John Wilkes Booth got in the box and wedged the door shut with a piece of plank that just so coincidentally happened to be there, perfect size and dimensions to wedge the door shut. Mainline historians will say, oh yeah, well, Wilkes Booth knew the area, he knew the theater, so he must have come earlier in the day and cut the thing to size, for later on. That is pure speculation, which is hilarious because there is absolutely zero evidence. It's just little bullshit added to make the official narrative fit, but to try to make it make sense, but it really doesn't. So we are told Wilkes Booth comes into this place. Think about it. And Wilkes Booth, a rich man, someone that was making $20,000 a year, which would be the equivalent to like $300,000 in today's money. He was making some bank. He had some extra cash. chose as a weapon of choice a one-shot Derringer. I don't know if you're familiar with a one-shot Derringer, but it looks like a little toy gun. It's like the size of your gun. Now it carries a 44 ball, which is a pretty good sized ball, but it was wildly inaccurate. And so that's why Booth had to put it directly to his head, to discharge it, because from even a short distance, it was completely inaccurate. This is the same time when the Colt revolver was already invented. Why the hell are you going to take this cheesy ass gun? Why the hell are you going to take this gun when you don't even know if Ulysses S. Grant is going to be in there, who would have been packing some heat? When there's going to be a guard outside, you're expecting a guard, but just coincidentally, this guy decides to get drunk and not be there at his post. But you're going to take a goddamn gun and a knife? That makes absolute zero sense. Especially, and you can't say it's money because Booth was making some bank, so he could have easily bought a couple of revolvers instead, and then he could have gone Rambo on that ass. But instead, he decides to take a one-shot fucking Derringer and a Bowie knife. This is what we are told and we are supposed to accept. So now picture the scene. John Wilkes Booth opens the door. The door was open, apparently. He walks in. He then closes the door. You have to imagine you can't be holding a knife or a gun while you're wedging the door shut. I mean, I think that's just common sense, right?
Right.
And that has to take a few seconds to do in a small little room. I just want people to picture a 10 by 7 foot room. So this guy's coming in, wedging the door super tight, so tight that Rathbone says it took considerable force to later remove that wedge to allow people to come in and tend to the president. And no one at any point realizes this shit is going on. That part of it makes zero sense. So I'm of the position now that I highly doubt that any of that of the official story took place. I'm finding it super hard to believe. And especially coming from the only testimony was from Henry Rathbone from a memorized script. And then when you try to visualize the whole event going down, it makes zero sense. We're also told that he jumped, and most people will say he broke his leg and delivered this theatrical speech. I have torn my ligaments on my left ankle. Your foot turns into rubber. You've got zero support. But you're going to tell me this guy jumps from there, breaks his leg, delivers his speech without screaming or crying or yelling, does it like a fucking boss and hauls ass with a broken leg? I don't believe it, man. And you read some of the witness accounts to it, and you will hear from people saying that the whole thing looked almost like it was part of the play, like it was fake. I put that on my Twitter the other day. I highlighted that part on the newspaper. People were like, yeah, they didn't know what was going on. It almost looked fake. And so I've come to the conclusion that the events that took place in Ford's Theater, in my, in review of the evidence and witness accounts, that have indeed become fake and gay.
Yeah, man.
And I try to give you, man, I can go in super, super deep. Oh, before we move on from that, an interesting thing is I told you earlier, Thomas Eckert was the guy that declined Lincoln, from being in the presidential box with him because he was busy. Interestingly enough, the telegraph lines went down for a few hours.
Right. I did hear about that.
And Thomas Eckert said that he was too busy. So he was so busy, and yet the telegraph lines went down. I mean, come on now, man. And to me, that is eerily reminiscent to the cameras going down, for Jeff Epstein, just coincidentally when he decides to off himself. This is what I mean, man. You start to see so many similarities. Another interesting similarity to this that people may relate to is I've come to look at the Trump alleged assassination as fake, as theatrics. And part of the reason why is you see Lincoln assassinations. When you hear Trump talking about Lincoln, he idolizes him. He views him as a role model. He wants to be on that same level someday. And then so Booth comes into the box. He's a right-hander. He's holding the one-shot Derringer. So I'm trying to try to lay down visually the scene of the crime. Booth comes in. Lincoln is the first one right there by the door. His left shoulder is to the wall by the door, and his head is looking that way. Now, we are told the bullet came in through Lincoln's left ear and got lodged under his right eye. So if you're a right-hander, try to visualize that. That is such a goofy-ass shot. You see what I'm saying? Because his left ear is by the wall. You see what I'm saying? And so for Lincoln to get that right ear and for it to be coming out the right eye, it's a tricky shot. Another thing that mainline historians will say is that to make the story fit is that Lincoln turned his head at just the right moment, and that's what got him killed. What do we hear with Trump? Yeah. Trump turned his head at just the right moment, but instead of dying like the loser Lincoln, he survives it like a boss.
Yeah, man.
It's so comical, man. Another interesting thing that I was able to pick up with the Trump assassination and the Lincoln assassination is in the Trump assassination attempt, quote unquote, you had photographer Douglas Mills, who infamously took a picture of George Bush the morning of 9/11, and then later was the one to capture with his 20 frame per second camera the bullet whizzing by his ear. So not only was he there for the 9/11 news in Sarasota Elementary School, but he was there to catch with his 20 frames per second. This is the shit that drives me crazy. People never bother even to question the most outlandish of claims that get passed off as fact. And so in the Lincoln assassination, you had this guy named Alexander Gardner, who was the guy that photographed Lincoln's death plate, who was the guy that photographed all the co-conspirators, and who was allegedly the only guy to ever photograph John Wilkes Booth's death face, which was later destroyed, which makes zero sense. Why would you destroy John Wilkes Booth's death plate? To me, it's kind of like burying Osama bin Laden's alleged body out in sea. Right, you know, right. So much shenanigans, man, with this whole thing. But I did want to bring up that whole Thomas Eckert, how this is another reason why he's viewed as a suspect. His one job was to take care of the telegraph lines, but yeah, they ended up going down anyway, so he wasn't doing shit. But any things before I kind of go over the Seward attack, because that's another key component. If you'd like, or we could definitely do a part 2, man. It's up to you.
Yeah, well, I'd definitely love to get deeper in this. We got a few minutes left, so I'm sure we can cover a little bit more. One question I did have, going back to Mary Todd Lincoln and any statement she had made, you said you could only find very little coming out of anything she even said about the whole thing?
Yeah, and it's super weird that a couple of weeks prior to this, she had bought $20,000 in today's money in mourning clothes. Another interesting thing is how there were at least 5 newspapers that had already written articles that Lincoln had already died when he was still alive. So there was more than certainly foreknowledge of the situation. And going back to Mary Todd Lincoln, people will say, yeah, she was crazy and she was hard to get along with, but that was her husband. You know, this is insane. Okay, well, you tell me why she didn't do jack shit during this whole incident. The only time she screamed was when Booth allegedly gave his speech and ran off the stage. That's when she decided to scream. Now, this is a little bit controversial, and I don't have too much evidence to support it, but I think it helped. You know, there are rumors that Abraham Lincoln was gay.
I heard this. Yeah.
Yes. And so this is important to my theory, because if he was indeed gay, that would explain why Mary Todd Lincoln didn't really give a fuck about her husband dying on that booth. Do you see what I'm saying? Um, and so what people will say to point to Abraham Lincoln's gayness, and some people will dismiss it, is Abraham Lincoln's relationship with his homie Joshua Fry. Um, him and Joshua Fry were roommates. Okay, that's one thing. But would you share beds? Now, people that are against this theory, this line of thinking of Lincoln being gay, will say, "Oh, well, that was a common thing back then. You can't do that. You can't draw conclusions." I'm like, dude, this was only 160 years ago. I ain't gonna be sharing beds with my fucking roommate, bro. Like, I'll sleep on the floor if I have to. You know what I mean? Unless I'm clapping that hairy ass cheeks, I ain't jumping in no damn bed, bro. You know what I'm saying? So now that's why I want to reiterate. I haven't found 100% smoking gun evidence to this, but it would definitely fit in line with why Mary Todd Lincoln didn't give a reaction that night, didn't comment. She was later put in an insane asylum through her son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who's another goddamn suspect, bro. Robert Todd Lincoln was not only there for his dad's assassination, he was there for the Garfield assassination and the McKinley assassinations. What are the fucking odds of this shit? And Robert Todd Lincoln is the one that interned his own mother into the nut house, into the loony bin. Robert Todd Lincoln also, a few years prior to the assassination, he was about to fall on the train tracks, and Edwin Booth, which was John Wilkes Booth's older brother, grabbed him by the clothes, and saved him from falling into the train tracks. What are the odds of that? Another weird ass coincidence. John Wilkes Booth was clapping the cheeks of Lucy Hale, who apparently was John Wilkes Booth's fiance, which is also interesting because Lucy Hale was the daughter of Senator Hale, who was a hardcore abolitionist. So here, the daughter of a hardcore abolitionist is dating the dude that is considered, wildly racist and wild. Makes zero sense, but he was clapping the cheeks. Also, John Wilkes Booth had slept in the bed where Abraham Lincoln ended up, expiring. So many wild coincidences, man. And this is what and just like with so many of these events, one coincidence, all right, I suppose it could happen. Two coincidences, it's a little crazy. But when you see so goddamn many, at what point do you say, all right, man, enough of this shit? I mean, here's another funny one there's quite a few with Lincoln Kennedy that people don't know about. They both had Vice President Johnsons. Lincoln was killed at Ford's Theater. Kennedy was killed in a Ford Lincoln.
Right. Wow.
So there's so many wild things, man. And yeah, we're probably gonna have to do a part 2 down the line because the Seward attack, in my opinion, is as equally entertaining as the stuff that happened in the Ford's Theater.
Yes, dude, we'll definitely have to get deeper. I love it, man. This is very compelling stuff. And like you said, there are just too many coincidences for it to just be that. There's something more to this. Again, great job with this. We're definitely going to have to do this again. Before we close out today, remind everyone where they can find you and where they can get more of this wonderful content.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've decided to be like the Cory Hughes of the Abraham Lincoln assassination. And so if you want more Lincoln stuff, I'm definitely going to be covering that. And like I said, I have David McGowan's book that I voiced over on my podcast players. Just search What is Truth podcast by Weezy on your favorite podcast player, preferably Spotify. You can leave comments, ratings. That definitely helps the show get through these censorious waters and algorithms. If you want video platforms, you can definitely find me on Rokfin. I'm now on Rumble. I'm also on Odyssey. So yeah, just search "What Is Truth" podcast by Weezy. Always a pleasure, man, and I thank you for having me on and talking about this very obscure topic that I fully realize a lot of people haven't gone into, but I want to make it exciting. I want people to look into it because you can learn from a lot from it by me bringing up a couple of examples with the Trump, assassination in current times. You can see these patterns, and this is what I mean. For me, this is why looking at these historical events, even though I don't believe jack shit of them, you learn from it. So once you start seeing them play out, you're like, oh man, I've heard this story already. I've already seen this shit play out. So you don't fall for it. You don't get duped.
Yeah. Yeah, you can become aware of the nonsense and form your own path and not fall for that shit. Weezy, thank you so much. This was great. We'll definitely be doing this again and getting deeper into it. And until next time, everyone have a wonderful evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. We'll see y'all then.